Welcome,
Hey
fellow
there,
wanderer
sleepy
of the long
wasteland
dark,
wanderers.
to the question the capital
Tonight,
wasteland
we're diving
keeps
into the
in
haunting
specific
beauty
silence
of the Fallout
where a specific
universe,
person
where
used to be
broken
the soldier
cities
who stood at the
whisper
Jefferson
forgotten
Memorial
stories,
and did
and
what
every
needed to be
shadow
done.
hides a tale of survival.
Dead 10 years
I'll
later,
be your guide
and
through
whose
these
specific
glowing
fate
ruins,
in the space
sharing
between
quiet
those two
moments
fixed
of hope,
points is the
resilience,
question.
and the eerie calm of a
Tonight,
world long
we
gone.
trace the full arc of Sarah Lyons, who she was, what she built, what she stood for, and what the wasteland became without her. The Potomac is still running. The purifier's light is still on the water. The question will keep. The Brotherhood of Steel that arrived in the capital wasteland was not the Brotherhood of Steel that most of the wasteland's people, in the years following its arrival, came to understand as the institution whose presence had changed the specific character of their world and whose specific form of engagement with their specific situation had produced the specific consequences that the subsequent decades were organized around managing and extending. The Brotherhood that arrived was a technology recovery operation whose specific mandate reflected the specific institutional priorities that the Lost Hills Brotherhood had developed across the decades of its post-war existence. Priorities organized around the acquisition and the preservation and the controlled management of advanced pre-war technology, rather than around the welfare of the civilian population living in proximity to the technology the institution was interested in recovering. The soldiers who traveled east under Owen Lyons' command were not traveling east because the capital wasteland's people needed them. They were traveling east because the ruins of Washington, D.C. contained a concentration of pre-war military and scientific infrastructure whose specific character represented exactly the kind of resource that the Brotherhood's institutional identity had always organized itself around. And the specific combination of military hardware and research facilities and advanced technological capability preserved within those ruins was a resource whose recovery the Lost Hills elders had determined was worth the specific costs of the expedition required to reach it. This is the honest account of where the Brotherhood that eventually became the Lyons Brotherhood began. And its honest acknowledgement is important for understanding everything that the Lyons Brotherhood subsequently became, because the specific character of the transformation from what the mission was at its origin to what it became under Owen Lyons' direction is the most direct available evidence about what kind of person Owen Lyons was and what kind of institution he was capable of building from the specific materials that the capital wasteland provided him. The mission that arrived in the capital wasteland with one set of priorities and the institution that eventually emerged from that arrival with a comprehensively different set of priorities are separated by the specific person whose specific choices produced the transformation, and the specific character of those choices and their specific implications for the institution they produced are essential context for understanding the specific person whose specific history this account is examining. What Owen Lyons found in the capital wasteland was the specific combination of things whose encounter produced the specific transformation that made him the figure he eventually became in the wasteland's history. He found the technology the mission had been sent to recover the ruins of the Pentagon that became the Citadel, the military hardware scattered across the ruins of Washington, D.C., the various pre-war facilities whose contents the Brotherhood's institutional mandate had always organized around acquiring. But he also found the specific human situation that the capital wasteland's post-war 2 centuries had produced the civilian communities living in the ruins of the pre-war world's most symbolically significant city, the super mutant threat whose specific character and specific scale were transforming the capital wasteland into something that the civilian population could not survive without significant external assistance, and the specific forms of human suffering that the combination of these conditions was producing for the specific people who had not had the option of leaving the specific environment they had inherited. The decision to stay, to establish a permanent Brotherhood presence in the capital wasteland organized not simply around the technology recovery mission that had justified the expedition, but around the protection of the civilian population against the super mutant threat, was a decision whose specific character diverged from the West Coast Brotherhood's traditional doctrine in ways that Lyons understood clearly, rather than stumbling into through institutional drift or simple mission creep. The West Coast Brotherhood's specific relationship to the wasteland's civilian population was a relationship of managed distance. The Brotherhood was not in the business of protecting the wasteland's people from the various threats that the wasteland contained. And the specific reasons for this institutional position were reasons that the Brotherhood's traditional doctrine articulated with enough clarity to make the position a deliberate choice rather than simply an oversight or a failure of institutional imagination. The Brotherhood protected technology. It did not protect people who were not Brotherhood. And the specific form of the institutional identity that this position expressed was an identity that the West Coast elders were not prepared to see, transformed by the specific encounter of one of their expeditionary forces with one specific wasteland's specific human situation. Lyons made his choice with a clarity about its implications that the subsequent events validated. The West Coast Brotherhood's response to his divergence was not ambiguity or gradual institutional negotiation, but the specific and decisive withdrawal of resupply, the cessation of communication, and the effective disowning of the Capital Wasteland chapter that left the Lyons Brotherhood in the specific condition of institutional isolation that shaped every dimension of its subsequent development. The Lost Hills elders understood what Lyons had chosen, and they responded to it in the most direct available form by removing the institutional support whose continuation had always been conditional on the expedition conducting itself in accordance with the doctrine whose terms the expedition's conduct was now explicitly violating. Lyons had known this would happen. The historical record supports the assessment that this specific knowledge was part of the context within which he made the choice rather than a consequence he failed to anticipate. And the specific character of the institutional isolation that followed was an isolation he had accepted as the cost of the specific commitment he had made. The Lyons Brotherhood that emerged from this isolation was an institution whose specific character reflected the specific combination of the people who had made the journey east and the specific experience of building something genuinely new without the institutional support that would have made the building considerably easier. The soldiers who stayed with Lyons when the institutional break with the West Coast became definitive were soldiers whose specific choices had aligned with his, whose specific assessments of what the situation required and what the Brotherhood should be doing had led them to the same conclusions that Lyons had reached, and whose continued presence within the institution that emerged from the break constituted the specific human foundation from which everything the Lyons Brotherhood eventually became was built. These were not simply loyal soldiers following a commanding officer's directive. They were people who had encountered the same specific evidence that Lyons had encountered and had arrived at similar conclusions about what it required. And the specific institution they built together was the institutional expression of those shared conclusions, rather than simply the organizational legacy of one man's individual vision. The Citadel, the specific fortification that the Brotherhood built within and around the ruins of the Pentagon, was the physical expression of what the Lyons Brotherhood had decided to be and what it had decided to do. And the specific character of what the Citadel was and how it operated reflected the specific institutional identity that the choices made in the Capital Wasteland's first years of Brotherhood presence had produced. It was a place organized around the dual requirements of military capability and genuine engagement with the world outside its walls. The specific combination of genuine fighting power and genuine investment in the civilian population's welfare that the Lyons model required the institution to maintain simultaneously, and that the Citadel's specific structure was designed to support. The soldiers who trained within it were training for a specific mission whose character was different from the training that the West Coast Brotherhood soldiers were receiving, and the specific forms of excellence that the Lyons Brotherhood cultivated in its members reflected the specific demands of a mission that required engagement with the Wasteland's people rather than simply management of its technology. Owen Lyons as a father is inseparable from Owen Lyons as an elder in the specific way that matters most for understanding the person his fatherhood produced. Sarah grew up within the institution her father had built, which means she grew up within the specific expression of her father's values in institutional form, and the specific character of the person she became was shaped by the specific character of the institution within which she developed in ways that made the distinction between the personal and the institutional dimensions of her formation genuinely difficult to maintain. Her father's genuine commitment to the capital wastelands people was not simply a policy position she had been taught to hold, it was the specific environment within which she had grown up, the specific form of the world she had always inhabited, and the specific values that the people around her had expressed in their daily conduct from the first years of her conscious experience. The Lyons Brotherhood's specific form of care for the wasteland's civilian population was not something Sarah had arrived at through philosophical deliberation. It was the specific air she had breathed from the beginning, and its specific character was therefore her specific character in the most direct available sense. The capital wasteland that Sarah grew up in was a world of specific and sustained danger whose specific character shaped the specific person she became in ways that the biographical record supports characterizing with some confidence. The super mutant threat was not an abstract institutional concern for the Brotherhood's strategic planning apparatus. It was the specific and daily reality of the world outside the Citadel's walls, the specific form of violence that the people she had grown up knowing and caring about faced in their specific communities across the ruins of a city whose pre-war significance made the specific form of its post-war degradation particularly affecting. Growing up in the shadow of this specific threat, in an institution organized around addressing it, under a father whose specific commitment to the people threatened by it had cost him the institutional support of the Brotherhood he had come from. This was the specific formation that produced the specific person who eventually led Lyons' pride into the ruins of Washington, D.C. and stood at the Jefferson Memorial and did what the situation required without hesitation or qualification. The capital wasteland had made Sarah Lyons specific in the most important available sense, had made her not simply a capable soldier with a general commitment to the Brotherhood's mission, but a person with a specific and direct and personal investment in the specific people and the specific world whose welfare the mission was organized around protecting. The divergence that Owen Lyons had chosen was not simply an institutional question whose resolution affected the Brotherhood's doctrinal purity. It was the foundational fact of Sarah's existence as the person she became, the specific condition that had produced the specific institution within which she was formed, the specific isolation that had shaped the specific character of the Brotherhood's development, and the specific stakes of the question about what the Brotherhood was, for that her life and her death were both organized around. Understanding what happened to Sarah Lyons requires understanding where she came from, and where she came from was the specific institution that her father had built in the specific moment of his specific choice to diverge from the Brotherhood's traditional doctrine in response to the specific human situation that the capital wasteland had presented him with. That choice's specific character was in her, as directly and as completely as anything that one generation can transmit to the next through the accumulated daily expression of what they believe and how they live it. The soldier that Sarah Lyons became was not the product of any single formative experience or any single institutional influence, but the accumulated product of a specific childhood in a specific place under a specific set of pressures, whose combined character produced the specific combination of qualities that the canonical record documents in her, with enough consistency to support confident characterization rather than simply the impressionistic sketch that the game's limited direct documentation of her inner life might otherwise constrain the examination to. She grew up in the Citadel, which means she grew up in a fortress, which means she grew up in the specific psychological environment that fortress living produces in the children who inhabit it. The specific combination of genuine security within the walls, and the specific and daily awareness of the genuine danger outside them that shapes a child's understanding of what the world is and what it requires of the people who move through it. The Citadel was not simply a military installation in the abstract sense of a place where soldiers trained and planned and maintained the capability for violence in service of institutional objectives. It was a community, the specific community that Owen Lyons had built around his specific vision of what the Brotherhood in the capital wasteland should be and do, and the specific forms of human relationship and human value that organized daily life within it were the forms that her father's specific vision had produced, and that the specific people who had chosen to remain with Lyons after the institutional break with the West Coast had committed themselves to expressing in the conduct of their lives. Growing up within this specific community meant growing up surrounded by adults whose specific commitment to the people of the capital wasteland was not a policy position or an institutional directive, but a personal and genuine orientation. Toward the specific human situation, the wasteland contained adults who had made the specific choice to stay and to build and to fight in this specific place for these specific people rather than returning to the West Coast. Brotherhood's institutional embrace, and whose daily conduct expressed the specific values that choice reflected. Sarah absorbed these values not through formal instruction, but through the most direct available mechanism, through the daily experience of living among people who held them and expressed them in everything they did. Through the specific examples her father and the soldiers around her provided of what commitment to these values looked like in practice, and through the direct and personal engagement with the specific people and the specific world whose welfare those values were organized around. The brotherhood that raised her was not the brotherhood of the Codex in its most doctrinal form. It was the brotherhood of the specific human decision that her father had made in the specific moment of his specific encounter with the capital wasteland's specific situation. And the difference between those two things is the difference between the soldier she became and the soldier a West Coast Brotherhood formation would have produced in her place. The training that transformed Sarah from the Elder's daughter into the Brotherhood's most capable field soldier was training whose specific character reflected the specific demands of the capital wasteland's ongoing threats, rather than the more generalized preparation for the management of technology and the deterrence of the various actors who might threaten the Brotherhood's institutional interests that characterized West Coast Brotherhood formation. She was being trained to fight super mutants in the ruins of a city whose specific geography and specific infrastructure created the specific tactical environment that the capital wasteland's most acute ongoing threat required. Navigating effectively, she was being trained to operate in close coordination with the civilian communities whose protection the Lyons Brotherhood's mission was organized around, which meant training that included dimensions of engagement and communication and the specific forms of relationship with non-Brotherhood actors that the West Coast Brotherhood's training did not emphasize and did not require. And she was being trained under the direct influence of a father whose specific combination of strategic intelligence and genuine care for the people he served was the specific model of leadership she was developing within, which meant that her understanding of what leadership was and what it required was shaped from the beginning by an example whose specific character was as much about the quality of care for the people under and around her command as about the quality of the tactical decisions the command required making. The elevation to sentinel rank was the formal institutional acknowledgement of what the people around her had been able to observe directly across the years of her operational service, that she was genuinely and extraordinarily capable in the specific ways that the Lyons Brotherhood's operational environment most urgently required. The rank was the Brotherhood's highest field rank, and its specific significance within the Lyons Brotherhood's institutional context was the significance of a genuine assessment of operational excellence rather than the honorific conferral that family connection to the Elder might otherwise have enabled. Owen Lyons was not a person whose institutional record supports the characterization of someone who would have elevated his daughter to the highest field rank available if the elevation had not been warranted by genuine capability, And the specific people who served alongside Sarah and who would have been in the best position to assess the genuine quality of her operational performance were people whose respect for her is documented in the canonical record with enough consistency to establish that the respect was earned rather than simply appropriate to her institutional position. The sentinel rank meant something specific and serious, and the honest assessment of what it meant requires treating it as the genuine acknowledgement of genuine excellence rather than the institutional accommodation of the elders' family relationship. The specific dimensions of Sarah's character that the canonical record documents with enough consistency and enough specificity to support confident characterization are dimensions whose honest examination reveals a person who, the specific combination of qualities, was both genuinely remarkable and genuinely coherent, in the sense that the various elements of her character fit together into a recognizable whole rather than existing as a collection of separate traits, whose combination was simply the product of narrative convenience. Her genuine care for the capital wasteland's civilian population exceeded the institutional requirement of the Lyons Brotherhood's policy in the specific sense that the policy was the expression of her father's institutional vision, and her care was the expression of her own personal investment in the specific people. That vision was organized around serving a distinction that the canonical record supports making, because her engagement with Wasteland's people consistently reflects something warmer and more personal than institutional obligation alone would require. She knew the people she was protecting not simply as the abstract beneficiaries of the Brotherhood's humanitarian mission, but as specific individuals whose specific situations she had engaged with directly and whose specific welfare she cared about in the specific and personal way that direct engagement tends to produce in people who are genuinely paying attention to the humans they encounter. Her specific form of principled pragmatism, the willingness to do what the situation required without the paralysis of excessive ideological rigidity, combined with a specific commitment to principles that the pragmatism was always in service of, rather than simply in tension with, is documented in her approach to the lone wanderer most directly, but it is also visible in the canonical record of her leadership of Lyons' Pride and in her engagement with the various situations the capital wasteland's ongoing threats produced. She was not a person who allowed the perfect to be the enemy of the good in the specific wasteland sense of that phrase, the sense in which the genuinely terrible conditions of the post-war world required the people trying to address them to work with the materials available, rather than simply refusing to work until better materials presented themselves. She was willing to accept help from outside the Brotherhood's institutional structure when the help was genuinely available and genuinely useful, willing to work alongside people whose relationship to the Brotherhood's formal hierarchy was the relationship of temporary operational ally rather than institutional member, and willing to make the specific and sometimes difficult judgments about what the situation required that the difference between the ideal and the available always demands of the people responsible for the outcomes. Her relationship with the lone wanderer, the player character whose story Fallout 3 documents and whose specific involvement in the capital wasteland's most consequential sequence of events brought them into direct and sustained contact with Sarah, is perhaps the most directly informative single piece of the canonical record for understanding her specific character, because the relationship's specific dynamics illuminate dimensions of who she was that the more institutional dimensions of the record do not make as directly visible. She engaged with the lone wanderer with a combination of genuine respect for their demonstrated capability and genuine wariness about the specific character of their situation. An outsider whose investment in the capital, Wasteland's outcomes was genuine, but whose relationship to the Brotherhood's institutional structure was the relationship of someone who had not been formed within it and who could not be assumed to share the specific values and specific commitments that the Brotherhood's formation was designed to produce. This is the specific form of engagement that genuine discernment produces in a person who takes seriously both the value of capability and the importance of the values that capability is being deployed in service of. and its specific expression in Sarah's documented interactions with the lone wanderer reflects a person whose assessments of the people she encountered were neither naively generous nor reflexively suspicious, but carefully attentive to the specific evidence those encounters provided. The specific quality of her leadership, what distinguished her approach to commanding Lyons' pride from the approach that a simply technically excellent military leader might have taken with the same operational responsibilities, is documented in the specific character of the squad's internal relationships and in the specific ways that the squad's members describe and engage with her in the canonical record. Lyons' pride was not simply a collection of the Brotherhood's most capable individual soldiers assembled into a single operational unit. It was a genuine community of people whose specific relationships to each other and to their commanding officer had been shaped by years of shared danger and shared commitment and the specific forms of mutual investment that surviving together in genuinely terrible circumstances tends to produce in the people who do the surviving together. The specific loyalty that the Pride's members displayed towards Sarah was not the loyalty of soldiers toward a superior officer whose rank demanded deference, but the loyalty of people who had been led by someone whose specific, the combination of genuine capability and genuine care for them as individuals had produced in them the specific form of trust that genuine loyalty actually requires, the trust that comes from knowing that the person directing your actions is directing them with the full weight of their understanding of your specific situation and their genuine investment in your specific welfare alongside whatever broader objectives the mission requires pursuing. The specific relationship between Sarah's values and her father's vision is worth examining with more care than the simple inheritance framework. The idea that she simply absorbed and reproduced what he had built suggests is adequate, because the canonical record supports a more complex account of how his vision and her values related to each other than simple transmission between generations can fully capture. Sarah had grown up within the specific institution her father had built, which meant she had grown up with the direct and daily experience of what his vision looked like in practice, rather than simply the abstract articulation of what the vision claimed to be. The specific things his vision had produced in the real world of the capital wasteland, the specific communities it had protected, the specific people whose lives it had made better or preserved against the specific threats that would otherwise have claimed them, the specific costs it had imposed on the Brotherhood and on the people who served within it, were the evidence she had available for assessing the vision's actual worth, and her commitment to the values the vision expressed was a commitment grounded in that evidence rather than in simple filial loyalty to the person who held the vision. She believed what she believed because she had seen what the believing produced, and the specific character of what she had seen was the specific evidence that the capital wasteland provided for the worth of the Lyons Brotherhood's specific answer to the question of what the Brotherhood should be and do. The question of what the Lyons Brotherhood's specific answer to that question was the specific content of the institutional vision that Sarah had grown up within and come to hold as her own through the specific experience of. Living within its expression is itself worth articulating directly as part of the honest account of who she was and what her death eventually meant. The Lyons Brotherhood believed that the Brotherhood's extraordinary capability created an obligation toward the people living in the world. The capability was operating within that the specific combination of military power and sign, technological sophistication and institutional organization that the Brotherhood represented was not simply a resource to be conserved and deployed in service of the Brotherhood's own survival and the acquisition of the technology the institution was built around, but a capacity that the specific human situation of the Wasteland's people required the institution to direct toward their welfare and their protection. This was the specific institutional answer to the Brotherhood's most fundamental question that Sarah had been shaped by and had come to embody, and the specific character of what her death eventually produced in the institution she had devoted her life to expressing was the specific measure of what the wasteland lost when the person who most fully embodied that answer was gone. Lyons' pride existed as the most concentrated and the most visible single expression of everything the Lyons Brotherhood was at its best. And the specific character of what the Pride was and what it represented is worth examining with the care that this centrality to the institution's identity demands. The squad was not simply an elite military unit whose excellence was the excellence of individual capability assembled into collective form for operational efficiency, though it was certainly that in the most straightforward and most literal sense. Because the people who comprised it were genuinely among the most capable soldiers the capital wastelands Brotherhood had produced, and their collective effectiveness in the specific environments where the capital wasteland's most acute threats required direct engagement was genuine and documented, and not simply the product of their commanding officers' distinguished parentage. The Pride was something more specific and more significant than a collection of excellent individuals. It was the institutional expression of what Sarah's specific form of leadership produced when it was applied to the specific task of building an operational unit from the specific people who were willing and capable of serving within it. Kodiak, Sentinel, Kodiak, the large and stoic and entirely reliable soldier whose specific combination of physical capability and absolute loyalty to the Pride's mission and the Pride's commanding officer constituted one of the most consistent presences in the squad's canonical documentation, was the clearest single expression of what the Pride's internal culture had produced in the people who served within it. His specific relationship to Sarah was the relationship of someone who had been led well and who knew it in the specific way that people who have been led badly in other contexts know what genuine leadership looks like when they finally encounter it, the relationship of recognition and commitment that distinguishes genuine respect from the performed deference that institutional authority alone tends to produce. He was following a person whose specific character had earned the specific form of his specific commitment, and the particular quality of his documented loyalty to her reflects something about what she had built within the Pride that the more abstract characterization of her leadership qualities alone cannot fully communicate. Gallows, Night Gallows, whose specific edge and specific darkness within the squad's documented character represented the Pride's acknowledgement that the capital wasteland's specific threats required a specific willingness to engage with the most direct and the most brutal of the available responses, was the expression of a different dimension of what the Pride contained and what Sarah's leadership had been required to cultivate alongside the more straightforwardly admirable qualities that the unit's reputation tended to emphasize. Sarah was not naive about what continuous engagement with super mutants and raiders and the various forms of organized violence that the capital wasteland concentrated in its specific urban environment required of the people doing the engaging. Gallows was the specific and honest acknowledgement within the Pride's composition that effectiveness in that environment required a specific willingness to inhabit a specific darkness that the more conventional accounts of the Brotherhood's role in the wasteland tended to manage away from direct acknowledgement, and Sarah's willingness to include that acknowledgement within the Pride's composition was itself evidence about the specific quality of her leadership's engagement with the reality of what the mission required rather than the idealized account of what the mission was supposed to be. Sergeant Vargas and Knight Captain Colvin and the others whose presence in the Pride's canonical documentation provides enough specificity to support characterization were people whose specific combinations of qualities reflected Sarah's specific approach to building a unit whose effectiveness required the integration of different forms of capability around a shared commitment to the specific objectives the Pride's mission was organized around. Pursuing. She was not building a unit of identical soldiers whose excellence was the excellence of a single kind of capability applied consistently across all contexts. She was building a unit of specific people whose specific differences complemented each other in the specific ways that the full range of challenges the capital wasteland's most dangerous environments presented actually required. And the specific composition of the Pride reflected a sophisticated understanding of what genuine operational effectiveness in that specific environment actually demanded of the people trying to achieve it. The squad's operational record, the specific engagements, and the specific missions that the Pride's documented history encompasses across the years of its active service in the capital wasteland is evidence about Both the unit's capability and the specific character of the threats they were organized around addressing, whose honest examination requires attending to what the record actually contains, rather than simply noting the general fact of the Pride's distinguished service. The supermutant incursions that the Pride addressed in the ruins of Washington, D.C. were not the abstract strategic challenge of a distant threat managed from a position of institutional safety, but the immediate and daily reality of direct engagement with a specific and genuinely formidable enemy in the specific and genuinely dangerous environments where that enemy was most concentrated. The ruins of the DC Mall, the various facility complexes scattered through the city's remains, the specific locations where the supermutant threat was most acute and where the Pride's engagement with it was most direct. These were places where the quality of the Pride's capabilities was tested against the specific resistance that the supermutant presence in those locations provided. And the Pride's documented effectiveness in these environments is genuine evidence about the specific quality of what Sarah had built, rather than simply the institutional commendation that organizational loyalty tends to produce for its most prominent formations. The name Lyons Pride carried a weight beyond the simple identification of the unit's commanding officer and institutional affiliation, and the specific character of that additional weight is worth examining directly, rather than allowing the straightforward reading of the name's obvious meaning to foreclose the more complex account of what bearing that name meant for the people who bore it. It announced a specific relationship to the Elder's vision, not simply the organizational hierarchy of a unit commanded by the Elder's daughter, but the specific commitment to the specific values that the name Lyons had come to represent in the capital wastelands brotherhood context. To serve in Lyons Pride was to serve in the specific expression of the Lyons Brotherhood's most concentrated form, in the unit that bore the name that announced most directly what the Lyons Brotherhood was and what it was trying to be. The specific pride that the Pride's members took in the name was not simply the pride of belonging to an elite unit, it was the pride of belonging to the specific institutional expression of a specific set of values whose rightness the direct experience of the capital wasteland had validated for each of them through the specific evidence of what those values had produced and what the world looked like when they were applied honestly and consistently to the specific challenges it contained. The Pride's dissolution, the specific fact that Lyons Pride as an operational unit did not survive the decade between Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 in any form that the canonical record acknowledges as continuing, is itself one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the full account of what happened to Sarah and what her death meant for the institution she had built and led. The squad's existence was so thoroughly organized around her specific leadership and the specific values her leadership expressed that the absence of her leadership was not simply the departure of a commanding officer who could be replaced by another commanding officer with equivalent capability. It was the removal of the specific organizing principle around which the unit's identity had been built, and the specific dissolution that followed was the institutional expression of the specific form of the loss. The fact that what Sarah had built in Lyons Pride was something that her specific combination of personal character and personal history and personal investment in the specific world she was working within had made possible, and that the specific conditions of its possibility were conditions that did not survive her. The specific context of the Enclave's return to active operations in the capital wasteland and the specific character of the threat that Project Purity represented in Enclave hands is essential background for understanding the specific sequence of events whose culmination at the Jefferson Memorial produced both the most consequential single achievement of Sarah's life and the specific circumstances of her survival that the decade of her unrecorded history began from. Project Purity had been James's life work, the specific and ambitious effort to clean the Potomac and provide genuinely clean water to the capital wasteland's entire population, whose humanitarian implications were so significant that the Enclave's determination to acquire and weaponize it was itself the most direct possible expression of what the Enclave understood itself to be and what it intended to do with the power it was working to reassert. In the wasteland, it believed it had the right to govern. The modified FEV that the Enclave intended to introduce into the Purifier's output was not simply a military weapon in the conventional sense of a technology designed to harm specific enemies in specific engagements. It was a program of comprehensive and systematic elimination, the specific and deliberate application of the Enclave's specific understanding of who counted as genuinely human and who represented the genetic contamination that the post-war world had produced, and that the Enclave's vision of the future required removing before the genuine reconstruction of American civilization could proceed. The Brotherhood's engagement with this specific threat was the engagement of an institution whose specific values in the Lyons Brotherhood's specific expression of those values placed it in direct and necessary opposition to what the Enclave was proposing to do with Project Purity, and the specific character of that engagement was shaped in every dimension by the specific person who led the Brotherhood's most capable operational unit into the specific confrontations that the Enclave's presence in the place's capital wasteland required addressing. Sarah understood what was at stake in a specific and personal way that went beyond the strategic assessment of the institutional threat the Enclave represented to the Brotherhood's continued operation in the region. She had grown up among the specific people who would have died if the modified FEVI had reached Project Purity's output, had grown up knowing their names and their faces and the specific forms of their specific lives in the ruins of the city she had spent her life defending. The Enclave's plan was not, for her, the abstract threat of a distant catastrophe. It was the specific and personal threat of the destruction of specific people she had specific and direct reasons to care about, and the specific quality of her engagement with the sequence of events that culminated at the Jefferson Memorial reflected this specific and personal dimension of what the stakes were, alongside the institutional and strategic dimensions that her role as Lyons Pride's commanding officer required her to address. The Jefferson Memorial itself, the specific building whose pre-war significance as one of the monuments to the founding ideals of the nation that the bombs had destroyed, gave it a specific and layered resonance within the capital wasteland's post-war geography, was the specific location where the Enclave's plan and the Brotherhood's opposition to it reached the specific and final confrontation whose outcome determined what the subsequent decade of the capital wasteland's history would be organized around managing and building on. The specific sequence of events that brought Sarah and the Lone Wanderer to the memorial's control room, the engagements in the surrounding area, the specific tactical challenges that the Enclave's defensive presence created, the specific and final approach to the chamber where the Purifier's controls were located, was a sequence whose specific character reflected both the genuine excellence of the Brotherhood forces engaged in it and the specific and terrible cost that genuine excellence in genuinely terrible circumstances consistently requires. The control room was irradiated in the specific way that the activation sequence required. The person entering it to accept the radiation was not simply a tactical hazard to be managed with appropriate protective equipment, but the specific and lethal consequence of completing the activation in the specific conditions that the Enclave's interference had created. The specific question of who entered the control room in the game's variable ending the Lone Wanderer or the BOS Enforcer Sentinel, Sarah Lyons, is the specific and central question of the endgame's moral dimension, and its specific character as a choice the player makes, rather than a fact the narrative determines, is itself the most direct expression of what the game understood the ending to be about. But what the canonical record most directly establishes about Sarah's presence in the endgame sequence is the specific fact that she was there, that she survived whatever the specific character of the ending the canonical record assumes produced. That she was present and functional and alive at the conclusion of the events whose completion the Purifier's activation represented, and that this specific survival was the last fixed point in her documented history before the decade of silence that the Fallout 4 canonical record eventually broke with the specific and limited account of her death that it provided. What Fallout 4 says about Sarah Lyons is, in the most direct and the most honest possible account, considerably less than the question of what happened to her requires. It says that she died. It says that she briefly held the position of elder following the death of Owen Lyons. It says that Arthur Maxson subsequently became elder of the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood chapter, and that the Brotherhood, under his leadership, has undertaken the journey to the Commonwealth to address the threat the Institute represents. This is the complete content of what the canonical record directly establishes about Sarah's fate. 3 facts, each significant in its implications, and each requiring careful examination, none of which provides anything approaching the specific account of the specific character of her death that the question the title of this script poses most urgently requires. The deliberate and sustained character of this sparseness is itself the first and most important thing to acknowledge about what Fallout 4's account of Sarah Lyons actually is. The franchise has had 10 years from the 2008 release of Fallout 3 to the 2015 release of Fallout 4 to develop whatever account of Sarah's fate the creative team chose to develop. And what they chose to develop in that 10 years was the specific account of her elder tenure and her death that Fallout 4 provides, rather than the more expansive and more specific account that the question's obvious importance within the franchise's narrative would seem to demand. This is not the accidental residue of incomplete world building. It is the specific choice of people who understood that the question of what happened to Sarah Lyons was a significant question whose specific treatment would have significant implications for the franchise's relationship to the Capital Wastelands story and to the specific people who had invested in that story across the years between the 2 games. The timeline is the first dimension of what Fallout 4 establishes that deserves careful examination, because the specific 10-year gap between the 2 games and the specific sequence of events within that gap. Maxson's rise is itself one of the most significant pieces of evidence available about the specific character of what the gap contained. The sequence is not established in its specific temporal ordering within the decade by anything the canonical record directly documents the question of whether Sarah's elder tenure preceded or followed her father's death. By a significant interval, the question of how long her tenure was before it ended. The question of when, within the decade, the specific events that produced the institutional transition occurred are questions whose answers the available canonical evidence does not directly provide, and whose honest assessment requires the specific acknowledgement that the temporal ordering is one of the more significant open dimensions of the gap, rather than an established fact whose implications simply need to be traced. Arthur Maxson's age is perhaps the single most informative specific fact that the canonical record provides for the assessment of what the decade contained, because the specific implications of a person being in their mid-20s at the time of Fallout 4 for understanding what their trajectory must have been within the decade between the 2 games are implications whose honest examination reveals a great deal about the specific conditions that must have obtained for the transition from Sarah's leadership to Maxson's to have been possible at all. Maxson was a child during the events of Fallout 3, documented within that game as a young boy, the descendant of the original Brotherhood's founder, whose presence within the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood's institutional structure was the presence of a child rather than an adult member of the operational hierarchy. The trajectory from that child to the elder of the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood chapter in his mid-20s is a trajectory that required the specific and comprehensive removal of the more senior members of the Brotherhood's leadership structure who would otherwise have occupied the elder's position before a teenager could plausibly have been elevated to it, and the specific character of what that removal implied about the decade is one of the more consequential open questions in the full account of what happened during the 10-year gap. The institutional transformation that Maxson's Brotherhood represents the specific return to more traditional Brotherhood doctrine, the reduced emphasis on civilian protection, the reorientation toward technology acquisition, and the management of the specific threats that the Brotherhood's institutional identity had always organized itself around addressing is itself significant evidence about what Sarah's death meant for the institution she had briefly led, because the transformation's specific character is a transformation that the canonical record consistently presents as having occurred after her death, rather than during her leadership. The Brotherhood that appears in Fallout 4 is not the Lyons Brotherhood with a different commanding officer. It is a genuinely different institution whose specific relationship to the capital wasteland's civilian population and whose specific understanding of the Brotherhood's mission reflect a genuinely different answer to the Brotherhood's most fundamental question than the answer that Sarah had embodied and that her father had built the institution around expressing. This difference is not simply the product of Maxon's individual preferences or Maxon's individual relationship to traditional Brotherhood doctrine. It is the product of a specific institutional shift that occurred in the Madidi, the specific context of Sarah's death, and the specific conditions that her death created for the subsequent development of the institution she left behind. The specific ambiguity that the franchise has maintained about the exact character of Sarah's death, the specific refusal to provide the account of what killed her and when and under what circumstances that the question's importance would seem to demand, is a maintained ambiguity whose honest characterization requires treating it as a deliberate creative choice, rather than simply a gap awaiting eventual filling. The same franchise that has maintained the Great War's first strike ambiguity, that has declined to provide the comprehensive canonical resolution of the various open questions that its accumulated world-building has generated, has maintained a specific and sustained silence about the specific character of Sarah Lyons' death, that is most honestly understood as the expression of a specific creative position rather than the residue of incomplete planning. What that position is, what the maintained ambiguity about her death is doing within the franchise's broader engagement with the capital wastelands story, is itself one of the more significant questions that the honest examination of the gap in the record requires engaging with directly. The Brotherhood that Arthur Maxon inherited from the specific sequence of events that Sarah's death and Owen Lyons' death together produced was not the Brotherhood that either Lyons had built, and the specific character of what it became under his leadership, what it kept, and what it transformed, and what it simply abandoned in the specific process of reorienting the institution around the different answer to Brotherhood's fundamental question that Maxon's specific combination of background and training and institutional vision produced is the most concrete available evidence about what Sarah's presence had meant and what the specific conditions of her absence allowed the institution to become in the years following her death. The honest assessment of Maxon's Brotherhood requires something more than simple comparison with the Lyons model, and the straightforward verdict that the comparison produces for anyone who shares the Lyons Brotherhood's specific values. Because Maxon is not simply the inadequate successor to a superior predecessor, but a genuine leader of a genuine institution whose specific qualities and specific achievements deserve the honest acknowledgement that fair assessment requires before the account of what his leadership cost can be made with the specificity and the weight it deserves. Arthur Maxon is a capable person. The canonical record of what he has accomplished, the consolidation of the fractured elements of the capital wasteland Brotherhood into a genuinely functional and genuinely powerful institutional force, the acquisition of the Pridwin and the technological sophistication it represents, the development of the Brotherhood's operational capability to the level that the Commonwealth campaign required, the specific and sustained leadership of an organization whose institutional demands would have broken people of lesser capability is a record of genuine achievement that the honest engagement with his character requires. Acknowledging, rather than dismissing, in the service of making the contrast with Sarah's model cleaner and more morally comfortable than the evidence actually supports. He became elder in his mid-teens, which is a circumstance whose specific implications for the kind of person it required him to be in order to survive the position are implications that deserve acknowledgement rather than the simple observation that his youth makes the elevation remarkable. He navigated whatever the specific institutional dynamics of the post-Sarah Capital Wasteland Brotherhood were with enough effectiveness to emerge from that navigation as the unchallenged leader of a brotherhood that was significantly more powerful in Fallout 4 than anything the Lyons Brotherhood had been at the conclusion of Fallout 3. These are genuine capabilities whose genuine expression in genuine institutional achievement is real and not reducible to the contrast it provides with what came before. What Maxon is, not what his genuine capability and his genuine institutional achievement are specifically not, is a leader whose relationship to the Capital Wasteland's civilian population reflects anything resembling the specific commitment that organized the Lyons Brotherhood's identity and that Sarah's leadership had expressed most fully. The return to traditional Brotherhood doctrine that his leadership produced was a return that had specific and concrete consequences for the specific people and specific communities whose relationship with the Brotherhood had been organized around the Lyons model's specific commitments. And the honest assessment of what those consequences were requires the specific examination of what the Lyons Brotherhood had been doing for and with those communities that Maxon's Brotherhood does not and will not do. The Rivet City relationship, the specific and sustained engagement between the Lyons Brotherhood and the Capital Wasteland's most significant civilian community that the Lyons model had cultivated across the years of its operation is one example of the specific form of institutional connection that the return to traditional doctrine dissolved rather than preserved. The various smaller communities scattered across the ruins of the DC metropolitan area whose specific relationships with the Brotherhood had been shaped by the Lyons model's specific approach to civilian engagement are communities whose subsequent relationship with the Brotherhood under Maxon's leadership is a relationship organized around considerably more distance and considerably less investment in the specific character of their welfare than the Lyons Brotherhood's model had produced. The specific dimensions of the institutional shift are worth examining in their most concrete available form, rather than simply as the abstract characterization of a change in doctrine, because the abstract characterization tends to make the shift seem smaller and more manageable than the specific experience of the people whose lives the shift affected directly. The Brotherhood under Lyons had been an institution that people in the Capital Wasteland could approach that had the specific forms of openness to engagement with the Wasteland's civilian population that the Lyons model required, and whose presence in the Wasteland's political landscape was a presence organized around genuine investment in the Wasteland's future, alongside whatever institutional interests the Brotherhood was also pursuing. The Brotherhood under Maxon is an institution whose relationship to the Wasteland's civilian population is organized primarily around the assessment of what those civilians represent in terms of the specific threats and specific resources that the Brotherhood's institutional objectives require addressing, and the specific difference between those two institutional relationships to the people of the Wasteland is a difference whose full weight becomes most visible when the specific people on the other side of the relationship are the ones whose account of it is attended to, rather than the institutional account of what the Brotherhood is doing and why. The specific things that Maxon's Brotherhood does not do that the Lyons Brotherhood did are worth enumerating with the concreteness that the honest assessment requires, rather than leaving at the level of the abstract characterization of a changed institutional orientation. The Brotherhood under Lyons sent its soldiers into the Wasteland's communities to address the specific threats those communities faced. The Raider presence, the supermutant incursions, the various forms of organized violence that the Capital Wasteland's geography and history concentrated in ways that the civilian population alone could not adequately address. This is not something the Brotherhood under Maxon does in any comparable way. The Brotherhood under Lyons maintained the specific institutional posture of an organization that understood its relationship to the Capital Wasteland's people as a relationship of genuine mutual investment, rather than simply the managed coexistence of a powerful institution with a less powerful population living in the same geographic space. This institutional posture and the specific forms of relationship and trust and investment it had produced between the Brotherhood and the Wasteland's communities across the years of the Lyons model's operation is not something the Brotherhood under Maxon reproduces or maintains in any form that the canonical record acknowledges. The specific human cost of these specific absences, the specific people whose specific situations are worse in the specific ways that the loss of what the Lyons Brotherhood provided produces in the specific communities the Lyons Brotherhood had been serving, is a cost whose attribution to the institutional shift that Sarah's death enabled is part of the honest account of what her death meant. What survived of Sarah's legacy within the institution Maxon inherited is itself informative about the specific character of what she had built, and what of it was durable enough to persist through the institutional transformation that followed her death. The Brotherhood's continued presence in the capital wasteland, its maintenance of the citadel, and its operational capability in the region is the most direct surviving expression of what the Lyons Brotherhood had established. Though the specific character of that presence under Maxon's leadership is sufficiently different from its character under the Lyons model to make the continuity of location and formal institutional identity the most obvious surviving element, rather than the continuity of the specific values and specific commitments that had made the location and the institutional identity meaningful in the specific way the Lyons Brotherhood had made them meaningful. The specific soldiers who had served under both Lyons and Maxon, and who carried the memories and the specific institutional formation of the earlier period into the later one, were the most personal and the most direct surviving expressions of what the Lyons Brotherhood had been, and the specific forms of tension and accommodation that the transition between institutional models required of those soldiers is itself part of the full account of what the decade between the two games contained and what Sarah's death produced within it. The East Coast Brotherhood that appears in the Commonwealth in Fallout 4 is the most fully developed, available evidence about what the institution became after Sarah, and the honest engagement with what the comparison between that institution and the Lyons Brotherhood reveals requires attending to both what the comparison illuminates and what it obscures. The Brotherhood in Fallout 4 is powerful in ways the Lyons Brotherhood was not better equipped, better organized, capable of projecting force at a scale, and with a sophistication that the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood of Fallout 3 could not have matched. This is a genuine fact about what Maxon's leadership produced, and its honest acknowledgement is required by the fair comparison between the two institutional expressions of the same organization. What the comparison most directly illuminates about the specific cost of the transition is the specific dimension in which the institution that became more powerful also became more indifferent, more capable of addressing the specific threats that the Brotherhood's institutional interests required addressing, and less invested in the specific welfare of the specific people who inhabited the specific world those threats were operating within. Sarah's Brotherhood was less powerful in the conventional sense and more present in the human sense, and the specific form of what was lost when the institution became more powerful and less present is the specific form of what her death meant for the wasteland she had spent her life serving. The specific theories about what killed Sarah Lyons that the available canonical evidence supports taking seriously are theories whose honest assessment requires distinguishing between what the evidence directly supports and what it has been used to support through interpretive steps whose validity is genuinely contested, because the gap in the record that the question of her death occupies is a gap into which the human desire for narrative resolution has consistently projected more certainty than the available evidence actually warrants. The theories are not equal in their evidential support. Some have stronger grounding in what the canonical record directly establishes, and some require more interpretive steps between the evidence and the conclusion. But the honest assessment of the strongest available theory requires the same epistemic honesty about the gap between consistent evidence and established conclusion that the preceding sections have applied to the other dimensions of question. The combat death theory is the theory that the most direct and the most honest reading of the available contextual evidence supports most straightforwardly. and its specific strengths deserve examination alongside the specific limitations that prevent it from being simply the settled answer that the question requires, rather than the best available hypothesis whose genuine evidential support is not equivalent to the confident conclusion its proponents sometimes treat it as. And its implications for understanding the distribution of the specific causes of death among the population of people in her specific position are implications that the honest assessment cannot ignore. Frontline soldiers in the capital wasteland die in combat with a frequency whose specific character is not simply the abstract statistical observation of a general rule, but the concrete and specific reality of an environment with the super mutant presence, the raider presence, the Enclave's operational capacity in the game's period, and the various other organized threats to human life that the capital wasteland concentrated in its specific geography were all producing casualties among the people engaged in addressing them at a rate that the Lyons Brotherhood's documented operational history makes entirely consistent with the general observation. Sarah was the best of those soldiers, which means she was operating at the point of greatest operational risk rather than the relative safety of institutional position, and the base rate of survival for the best frontline soldiers in the most dangerous operational environments is not a base rate that supports confident optimism about the long-term survival of even the most capable individual within it. The specific evidence for a combat death is not simply the general observation that frontline soldiers die in combat. It is the specific character of Sarah's continued operational engagement in the years following the Enster Purifier's activation. The specific ongoing threats that the capital wasteland's environment continued to produce for the people addressing them, and the specific absence of any canonical evidence for a cause of death that would require more specific explanation than the straightforward observation that a frontline soldier who continued doing frontline work in a genuinely dangerous environment eventually encountered the specific combination of circumstances that the environment was consistently producing for the people working within it. The combat death theory's specific strength is its consistency with everything the canonical record establishes about who Sarah was and what she continued to do after the Purifier's activation. And its specific limitation is the same limitation that afflicts every theory about a question whose answer the canonical record does not directly provide the gap between consistent evidence and established conclusion that the honest engagement with the available material must always acknowledge. The theory that Sarah died from injuries sustained during the events at the Jefferson Memorial, the delayed consequences of the radiation exposure, or the specific physical toll of the engagement's demands, producing a death in the weeks or months following the game's conclusion, rather than in the decade of the gap, has a specific appeal whose honest acknowledgement requires engaging with both the appeal and its specific limitations. The appeal is the narrative coherence of a death that was directly connected to the most consequential single act of Sarah's life, the specific and affecting closure of a life whose most defining moment was also its final wound, the specific form of sacrifice that the Purifier's activation represents being extended into the person who helped make it possible in a way that makes the cost of the achievement legible in the most personal available terms. The specific limitation is the canonical evidence of Sarah's functional survival at the game's conclusion, and the specific difficulty of connecting a death from injuries sustained in a single engagement to a decade-long gap, whose other contents, the elder tenure, the institutional transition, require her to have been alive and functional for at least some significant portion of the intervening time. The theory is not simply impossible, but the specific evidence required to support it more directly than the general observation of its narrative coherence is evidence that the canonical record does not provide. The theory that Sarah died in circumstances connected to the institutional tensions within the Brotherhood that the transition from Lyons doctrine to Maxon doctrine required navigating is the most disturbing of the available theories, and the one whose honest assessment requires the most careful distinction between what the evidence supports and what the desire to find a morally significant explanation for a significant death has projected onto the available evidence in excess of what it actually establishes. The specific sequence of events, Owen Lyons' death, Sarah's brief elder tenure, her death, Maxon's rise. The institutional shift is a sequence that raises questions about the relationship between the various events within it that the simpler theories do not fully address, and the honest engagement with those questions requires acknowledging that the sequence is at minimum suggestive of a more complex account of the transition than the straightforward narrative of sequential leadership succession typically implies. A brief elder tenure, followed by death, followed by the elevation of a teenager, and a comprehensive institutional shift, is a sequence whose specific character is more consistent with a period of acute institutional instability than with smooth and uncomplicated succession of institutional authority that the formal account of what happened tends to imply. And the honest engagement with what the sequence implies requires acknowledging the instability rather than treating the formal succession narrative as the complete account of what the decade contained. What the internal conflict theory most directly requires is evidence of the specific institutional tensions that would have made conflict of the kind it proposes both possible and plausible within the specific institutional context of the Pacers. Post-Fallout 3 Wasteland Brotherhood, and the canonical record provides enough in the way of general characterization of the institutional tensions between the Lyons model and the traditional doctrine to make the existence of those tensions within the Brotherhood's institutional life a well-established fact rather than simply an inference. The Brotherhood that Owen Lyons had built was not a brotherhood whose entire membership shared his specific vision of what the Brotherhood should be. The institutional divergence from West Coast doctrine that he had imposed on the expedition's survivors was a divergence whose specific implications for the various members of the institution were implications that different members assessed differently, and the specific combination of Sarah's continuation of her father's vision and the presence within the institution of people whose relationship to traditional brotherhood doctrine was more sympathetic than either Lyons had been, created conditions within which the institutional tensions that the traditional doctrine's advocates had been managing throughout the Lyons period would have found their most direct expression in the specific context of the power vacuum that Owen's death produced and that Sarah's brief tenure was required to navigate. Whether those tensions produced the specific form of direct conflict that the most dramatic version of the internal conflict theory proposes is a question the evidence does not answer. But the honest acknowledgement that the conditions for some version of institutional conflict existed within the post-Owen Brotherhood is a more defensible position than the claim that the transition from Sarah's leadership to Maxon's was accomplished with the smooth institutional consensus that the formal succession narrative implies. The disease and environmental cause theory, the specific hypothesis that Sarah died from illness or from the accumulated physical consequences of continuous exposure to the capital wasteland's specific environmental hazards, rather than from combat or institutional conflict, is the theory whose honest assessment requires the most direct engagement with the specific character of the capital wasteland's environment and what continuous residence and continuous operational activity within it produced for the people who inhabited it across extended periods. Radiation exposure was the most pervasive and the most consistent environmental threat in the capital wasteland, and the specific forms of radiation-related illness that continuous exposure at various levels produced in the wasteland's population, the various degenerative conditions, the specific oncological consequences, the general physiological degradation that chronic radiation exposure imposes on the human body, even at levels below those that produce acute radiation sickness, were conditions that did not spare the Brotherhood's soldiers, simply because those soldiers were better equipped than most of the wasteland's population to manage their radiation exposure. The Brotherhood's medical capability and the specific protective equipment that its members had access to reduced the specific risks of radiation exposure relative to what the general wasteland population faced. But the reduction was not elimination. and the specific forms of long-term consequences that even managed radiation exposure produces in people who live and work within heavily contaminated environments for extended periods are consequences whose specific implications for a soldier who had spent her entire life in the capital wasteland are not simply zero because she had access to better radiation management resources than most of her contemporaries. The illness theory's specific limitation is the same limitation that afflicts the injuries theory, the requirement that the death it proposes occurred during a period within which the canonical record suggests Sarah was functional enough to hold the elder position and manage whatever the specific institutional dynamics of the post-Owen Brotherhood required navigating, which means the illness would have had to have been either relatively rapid in its progression or occurring in a period following the institutional transition rather than during it. Neither of these constraints makes the theory impossible, but both impose specific requirements on its temporal structure that the available evidence does not directly support in the way that a more fully documented account of the decade would be required to provide. What the evidence cannot establish, the honest and direct acknowledgement of the specific limits of the available canonical material for answering the question the examination has been organized around, is itself the most important single conclusion that the examination of the various theories produces, because the specific character of what cannot be established is the specific character of the gap that the franchise has chosen to maintain, and the specific form of what that maintained gap is doing within the franchise's broader engagement with Sarah's story. None of the theories is directly confirmed. None is directly excluded. The available evidence is consistent with several different accounts of Sarah's death and inconsistent with none of the serious proposals that the examination has considered, and the honest position that this specific evidential situation requires is the position of genuine uncertainty about the specific answer rather than the confident adoption of the best available hypothesis as the settled conclusion. This does not mean that the theories are equally supported. The combat death theory has more direct evidential support than the others in the specific sense of being most consistent with the most facts the canonical record establishes. But the gap between the best supported hypothesis and the established conclusion is a gap whose honest acknowledgement is required by the evidence's actual character, rather than by epistemic caution for its own sake. The specific dimension of Sarah Lyons that the examination of her relationships most directly illuminates is the dimension that the institutional account of her significance tends to manage away from the center of the assessment in a specific way that institutional accounts always manage the personal toward the periphery in favor of the organizational and the strategic. Sarah was a specific person who had specific relationships with specific other people, and the specific character of those relationships is the most direct available evidence about who she was as a person rather than as an institution, the evidence that gets closest to the specific interior of her specific character, rather than the exterior expression of that character in the institutional roles and institutional achievements that the broader account of her significance is organized around. The relationship with her father is the foundational human relationship of her life in the most straightforward available sense, the relationship that was present from the beginning and that organized the specific context of her formation in the most direct and the most comprehensive way that any single relationship can organize a person's development. Owen Lyons was not simply Sarah's father in the abstract biographical sense. He was the specific person whose specific vision had created the specific world she grew up in, whose specific character was the most direct model of leadership and commitment and care that her development had access to, and whose specific relationship to her constituted the primary evidence she had available from the earliest years of her conscious experience for what a genuine investment in the people and the world around you actually looked like in the daily conduct of a life. The warmth between them that the canonical record documents is not the performed warmth of a public relationship that needs to present the appearance of familial connection alongside its institutional dimension. It is the specific and genuine warmth of two people who had been in each other's lives in the most direct and the most present way that the specific institutional context of their shared existence had permitted, and whose mutual regard was grounded in the specific and accumulated experience of that direct and present engagement rather than simply in the biological fact of the relationship. The institutional complexity of Sarah's position as the elder's daughter within the institution the elder led is a complexity whose specific character is worth examining directly rather than treating as simply the background condition of her position that the more important dimensions of her character and her story were played out against. Being Owen Lyons' daughter within the Lyons Brotherhood meant occupying a position that was simultaneously the most personally proximate to the center of institutional authority and the most exposed to the specific form of institutional scrutiny that family proximity to power tends to attract in any organization. The people around Sarah had reasons to watch the quality of her performance that went beyond the ordinary professional assessment of a colleague's capability. They had the specific and additional reason of determining whether what she achieved was genuinely her own achievement or the institutional expression of her father's authority, and the specific and sustained excellence that the canonical record documents as her operational performance was therefore required to be both genuinely excellent and visibly genuinely excellent in the specific way that people under the additional scrutiny of family proximity to power always need their excellence to be more evident than the evidence alone would otherwise require. She was aware of this. The canonical record supports the characterization of someone who understood what her position required of her in this specific dimension and who had developed the specific relationship to her own performance, that the understanding demanded the specific combination of genuine excellence and genuine humility about the relationship between that excellence and the institutional context that produced it, that the most self-aware occupants of such positions tend to develop. The specific grief that Owen's death produced in Sarah whenever it occurred within the decade, whatever the specific circumstances of its occurrence, is the dimension of her experience that the canonical record makes the least directly accessible, and that the imagination is therefore most required to engage with honestly, rather than simply projecting the generic form of filial grief onto the specific person and the specific relationship that Owen's death ended. She had lost her father, which is the universal dimension of the loss whose weight requires no special explanation. She had also lost the specific person whose specific vision had been the organizing principle of the institution she was leading and the world she had built her life around serving, which means she had lost not simply a parent, but the specific source of the specific understanding of what her work was for and what the world required of the people who cared about it, that had always been the foundation of her own engagement with both the work and the world. Grieving her father was inseparable, for Sarah, from confronting the specific institutional responsibility that his death transferred to her, and the specific question of whether she could maintain what he had built and continue expressing what he had stood for in the specific circumstances that the post-Owen Brotherhood's institutional dynamics created. The grief and the responsibility arrived together, and the specific form of what their arrival together required of her was one of the most significant and the most humanly demanding dimensions of the decade that the gap in the canonical record has left in the specific form of what can be imagined about it rather than what can be established from it. The relationship with Lyons Pride, the specific community of specific people whose shared service and shared danger and shared commitment to the specific mission that Sarah's leadership had organized them around had produced the specific bonds that distinguish genuine communities of shared experience from simple collections of individuals occupying the same institutional space, was the relationship that constituted, alongside her relationship with her father, the most direct and the most personal expression of who Sarah was and what she valued and what she had chosen to invest in as the human dimension of the institutional work she was doing. She knew the members of her squad with the specific and direct knowledge that continuous shared danger produces, knew their specific capabilities and their specific limitations and their specific fears and their specific forms of courage, and the specific ways that each of them engaged with the specific demands of the work they were all doing together. This specific knowledge was the foundation of her leadership, in the most important sense that leadership can have a foundation, the sense in which the quality of what a leader can ask of the people they lead depends on the quality of what the leader actually knows about those people, and what the leader genuinely understands of what the asking costs them. Kodiak's specific loyalty to her was the loyalty that this specific knowledge and this specific care had produced, the loyalty of someone who had been seen accurately and valued genuinely by the person directing his actions, whose specific combination of stoic exterior and the specific interior that the exterior was organized around protecting had been recognized rather than simply managed by the leader whose direction he was following. The specific quality of that recognition, the specific form of what it meant for a person of Kodiak's specific character to be led by someone who understood him with the accuracy and the care that Sarah's documented. Engagement with the people under her command reflects is the most direct available evidence about what Sarah's leadership meant for the specific people who experienced it, rather than simply the abstract characterization of what her leadership quality was. Gallo's relationship with Sarah was organized around a different dimension of her leadership than Kodiak's, but was equally informative about the specific character of what made her effective in the specific way she was effective. Where Kodiak's relationship with her reflected the quality of her care for the people under her command in the most direct and the most personally warm available form, Gallo's relationship reflected the quality of her willingness to engage honestly with the darker dimensions of what the mission required and what the people doing it were required to carry. She did not manage Gallo's edge by suppressing it or by surrounding it with the institutional language of appropriate professional conduct that would have made his specific capabilities simultaneously more manageable and less effective. She understood what he was and what his specific form of capability required in terms of the institutional context that could hold it without either suppressing it into uselessness or losing it to the specific forms of corruption that unconstrained darkness tends to produce in the people who inhabit it, and the specific management of that understanding, the specific form of leadership that could hold Gallows within the Pride's community without dissolving the specific qualities that made his presence within it valuable, was itself one of the more informative expressions of the full range of Sarah's leadership capability. The Lone Wanderer's relationship with Sarah is the relationship whose specific dynamics the canonical record documents most directly and in the most accessible form, because the game's specific narrative structure placed the player in the position of the person experiencing Sarah's engagement with them from the most direct available vantage point. She assessed the Lone Wanderer with a combination of genuine respect for their demonstrated capability and genuine uncertainty about the specific character of their relationship to the world. They were operating within a person who had arrived in the capital wasteland without the specific formation that the Brotherhood's institutional structure produced, and who was engaging with the wasteland's most consequential situations from a position of genuine individual investment that was simultaneously more flexible than the Brotherhood's institutional posture permitted, and less predictable than the institutional posture's managed investment in specific outcomes could comfortably accommodate. The respect was genuine. The Lone Wanderers demonstrated capability in the specific situations that their path through the capital wasteland required. Navigating was the kind of capability that Sarah's specific form of discernment recognized as genuine, rather than simply crediting the institutional narrative of exceptional individual contribution that the Brotherhood's various official accounts of the partnership tended to produce. The uncertainty was also genuine. She did not simply incorporate the Lone Wanderer into the Brotherhood's institutional framework and treat them as a standard institutional actor whose reliability could be assessed through the standard institutional mechanisms. She engaged with them as the specific and unusual person they were, which meant holding the uncertainty about their specific character and their specific motivations alongside the respect for their specific capability that the evidence demanded. The capital wasteland's people, the specific individuals and specific communities scattered across the ruins of Washington, D.C., and the surrounding region whose welfare the Lyons Brotherhood's mission was organized around, Protecting with a human reality at the center of what Sarah's engagement with her work was ultimately about, and the specific character of her relationship to those people is the most direct available evidence about the specific form of the care that motivated her engagement with the mission, rather than simply the institutional obligation that her role required her to perform. She had grown up among those people in the specific sense that the Citadel's walls had never prevented the specific forms of direct engagement with the communities outside them that the Lyons Brotherhood's model required, and that her father's specific approach to the mission had always organized itself around maintaining the people of Rivet City and Megaton and the various smaller settlements whose existence in the ruins of the pre-war world's most significant city constituted the specific human population that the Lyons Brotherhood's mission was organized around serving were not abstract beneficiaries of the institutional policy that Owen had built the Brotherhood around. They were specific people whose specific names and specific faces and specific situations Sarah had encountered in the direct and daily conduct of the work that the mission required, and the specific quality of her engagement with them reflected the specific and personal investment in their specific welfare that direct and personal engagement tends to produce in people who are genuinely paying attention to the humans they encounter, rather than simply performing the institutional role that requires appearing to care about them. What her absence meant for the people who had known her, for the specific members of Lyons Pride, whose community she had been the center of, for the lone wanderer, whose engagement with the capital wasteland had been organized around her specific partnership, for the Brotherhood soldiers who had served under her leadership and understood what her leadership had meant for the quality and the character of their service, for the civilian communities whose relationship with the Brotherhood had been organized around the specific form of the institution that her presence had most fully expressed, is the human dimension of the loss whose full weight the institutional account of what her death produced can point toward but cannot fully contain. Lyons Pride did not simply lose a commanding officer when Sarah died. It lost the specific person whose specific combination of genuine care for its members and genuine understanding of what the mission required had constituted the specific form of community that the Pride had been the specific organizing principle of the specific human bonds that had made the Pride more than the sum of its individual members' considerable individual capabilities. The specific grief that this specific loss produced in the specific people who experienced it is the most direct available measure of what Sarah Lyons' life had meant, and the specific character of what replaced that grief, or what failed to replace it in the subsequent years, is itself part of the full account of what the wasteland became without her. The Brotherhood of Steel is the franchise's most persistent and most philosophically demanding single institutional presence. The organization whose various incarnations across the full span of the Fallout series have consistently served as the most direct available expression of the questions about power and responsibility, and the relationship between exceptional capability and the obligation that exceptional capability creates toward the people living in the world the capability is operating within, that the franchise has always been most seriously interested in asking. Every installment that has engaged with the Brotherhood has engaged with some version of the same fundamental question: what is the Brotherhood for? What does its extraordinary combination of military power and technological sophistication and institutional organization imply about what it owes the Wasteland's people? And what the specific answer to those questions that any particular incarnation of the institution embodies reveals about the specific character of what the institution has become and what it has decided about itself and its relationship to the world it operates within. Sarah Lyons is not simply a character within this recurring institutional examination. She is the franchise's most fully developed and most directly affecting answer to the questions the examination keeps asking the person, whose specific combination of genuine Brotherhood capability and genuine care for the BT-17 Wastelands people represented the institution looking most fully and most honestly at what its own values most clearly implied it should be doing and actually doing it, rather than finding the various institutional justifications for not doing it that the Brotherhood's traditional doctrine had always provided. The Brotherhood's fundamental question has been answered differently by every major institutional expression the franchise has documented across its accumulated canonical history, and the range of those answers is itself informative about what the franchise understands the question to be genuinely asking, rather than simply the backdrop for the various narrative conflicts that the Brotherhood's presence in different wasteland environments has enabled. The West Coast Brotherhood of the original games was an institution that had retreated into a specific and self-protective insularity that had concluded the Wastelands people and the Wastelands problems were not its concern, and that its specific responsibilities were to the technology it had preserved and to the institutional survival of the organization whose purpose was the preservation of that technology. This was a coherent answer to the Brotherhood's fundamental question, and the specific form of its coherence, the specific way it resolved the tension between the institution's extraordinary capability and the obvious needs of the people living in proximity to that capability, by simply denying that the tension created any obligation was the coherence of a specific institutional choice rather than the necessary implication of what the Brotherhood was. The Mojave Brotherhood of Fallout New Vegas was an institution that had been broken by the specific failure of its most ambitious attempt to address the fundamental question in a form that went beyond simple insularity, that had tried to be something more than the West Coast model and had paid the specific and comprehensive price of that attempt in the form of the destruction that the NCR's superior military force had visited upon it. The Commonwealth Brotherhood of Fallout 4 was an institution that had returned to something closer to the traditional model under Maxon's leadership, while being more powerful than any previous Brotherhood expression, and therefore more capable of pursuing the traditional model's specific form of institutional priority with the comprehensive effectiveness that genuine power provides when it is combined with the institutional clarity of purpose that comes from having resolved the fundamental question in a specific direction. Against this range of answers, the Lyons Brotherhood's specific answer stands as the most directly and the most uncomplicatedly affirmative available response to the Brotherhood's fundamental question, the most complete expression of what the institution looks like when it takes seriously the obvious implication that extraordinary capability creates genuine obligation toward the people living in proximity to it. The Lyons Brotherhood did not resolve the tension between capability and obligation by denying the obligation, or by treating the Wastelands people as problems to be managed, rather than human beings whose welfare the institution was positioned to meaningfully improve. It resolved the tension by accepting the obligation and organizing the institution around fulfilling it, by treating the protection of the capital Wasteland's civilian population as the central expression of the Brotherhood's mission in the specific context of what the capital Wasteland required, rather than as the distraction from the real mission of technology acquisition that the traditional doctrine would have characterized it as. This is the specific character of the answer that Sarah Lyons embodied most fully and expressed most directly in the conduct of her life, and the specific significance of that embodiment for the franchise's ongoing engagement with the Brotherhood's fundamental question is the significance of a genuinely affirmative answer to a question the franchise has more often explored through the various forms of the negative, through the various ways the Brotherhood has failed to be what its values most clearly implied it should be. The Lyons model's specific advantages over the traditional Brotherhood approach are worth examining with the concreteness that the honest assessment requires, rather than simply the abstract characterization of a more humane institutional orientation. What the Lyons Brotherhood did that the traditional Brotherhood did not do was make the lives of specific people in specific communities specifically better in specific and measurable ways. It reduced the super mutant threat in the capital wasteland to a level that the civilian population could survive in ways they could not have survived if the Brotherhood's presence in the region had been organized around the traditional model's specific priorities rather than the Lyons model's specific commitments. The people of Rivet City had a relationship with the Brotherhood that provided specific benefits whose specific character was the specific character of what an institution with genuine military capability and genuine institutional investment in the community's welfare was able to provide for a community that had genuine need of both. The various smaller communities scattered across the DC ruins had a relationship with the Brotherhood that was organized around the genuine and direct engagement with their specific situations that the Lyons model required rather than managed distance that the traditional model had always maintained between the institution and the wasteland's civilian population. These are specific and concrete goods whose production required the specific institutional vision that Owen Lyons had built the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood around, and that Sarah had expressed most fully in the conduct of her specific and specific role within it. And the specific people who benefited from those goods are the most direct available measure of what the Lyons model's specific answer to the Brotherhood's fundamental question was worth. The Lyons model's specific vulnerabilities are also worth acknowledging honestly, rather than treating the model as the simply superior alternative, whose only limitation was the specific historical accident of not surviving in the form that would have allowed it to continue expressing what it stood for. The specific cost of the commitment to civilian protection that the Lyons model required was a cost that the institution bore in real and significant terms. The Brotherhood in the Capital Wasteland during the Lyons period was an institution that was less powerful than it might otherwise have been, if its resources had been directed primarily toward institutional expansion and technological acquisition rather than toward the ongoing operational demands of protecting a large civilian population against the specific and continuous threats that the Capital Wasteland concentrated in its geography. The West Coast Brotherhood's specific form of institutional insularity was, among other things, a specific form of resource conservation that made the institution more resilient in the specific sense of being less dependent on the ongoing success of its operational commitments for its continued institutional viability. The Lyons Brotherhood's specific form of institutional engagement with the Wasteland's people created dependencies and vulnerabilities that the traditional model's insularity had avoided, and the specific character of what those dependencies and vulnerabilities meant for the institution's long-term survival in the specific form that made it most worth surviving is itself part of the honest account of what the Lyons model was and what its expression in the specific institutional context of the Capital Wasteland ultimately produced. Why Sarah's embodiment of the Lyons model mattered, why the specific person she was and the specific way she expressed what the Lyons Brotherhood stood for in the specific conduct of her specific life constituted a contribution to the franchise's engagement with the Brotherhood's fundamental question that goes beyond the simple fact of her presence within the narrative, is the dimension of the assessment that requires the most direct and the most honest engagement with what the franchise has consistently been doing with the Brotherhood and what Sarah's specific place within that project was and is. She was not simply an instance of the Lyons model's institutional expression. She was the most fully developed and the most personally realized instance of it, the character whose specific combination of individual depth and institutional significance made her the franchise's most direct and most affecting exploration of the question of what the Brotherhood looks like when it takes its own values seriously in the most complete available sense. The specific combination of her biographical particularity, the specific person whose specific history and specific relationships and specific character the canonical record documents with enough depth to support genuine engagement with who she was as a person and her institutional significance, the specific role she played in the most consequential sequence of events in the Capital Wasteland's post-war history, and the specific things her presence and her absence meant for the institution she served, is the combination that makes her the franchise's most significant single expression of the Lyons model's answer to the Brotherhood's fundamental question. and its most significant single demonstration of what the wasteland loses when that answer is no longer present within it. The specific cost to the capital wasteland of the transition from Lyons Brotherhood to Maxon Brotherhood, the specific and concrete consequences for the specific people and specific communities whose relationship with the Brotherhood had been organized around the Lyons model's specific commitments deserves the direct and specific examination that the honest assessment of what Sarah's legacy consisted of and what its loss meant requires. The Lyons Brotherhood had been an institution that the capital wastelands people could count on in specific and practical ways that had organized its presence in the region around the specific forms of engagement with civilian welfare that the Lyons model required, and that had produced the specific forms of trust and the specific forms of mutual investment between the Brotherhood and the wastelands communities. Follow through on those commitments had accumulated. This specific and accumulated trust, the specific and practical expression of the Lyons model's answer to the Brotherhood's fundamental question in the daily reality of the institutional relationship between the Brotherhood and the communities it was serving, was itself one of the most significant things the transition to Maxon's model dissolved. Because trust that has been built through the consistent demonstration of genuine care over extended periods is not simply the institutional policy that produced it and cannot be transferred to a different policy with the simple continuity of formal institutional identity that the Brotherhood's unchanged name and unchanged location implied. The communities that had built their specific relationships with the Brotherhood around the Lyons model's specific commitments found themselves, in the aftermath of the transition, in a relationship with a different institution occupying the same formal position, an institution whose relationship to their welfare was organized around genuinely different priorities than the priorities that had produced the specific and accumulated trust they had invested in the Lyons Brotherhood across the years of its expression of those priorities. The specific forms of disorientation and the specific forms of vulnerability that this transition produced for the specific people who had organized their specific situations around the assumption of the Lyons Brotherhoods continued. Engagement with their specific welfare are themselves part of the honest account of what Sarah's death meant and what the wasteland's legacy from her life and from its ending actually consisted of for the people who inhabited the specific world she had spent her life serving. The franchise's engagement with the Brotherhood's fundamental question through the specific trajectory of Sarah's life and death and institutional legacy is the most direct available expression of the specific thing that Fallout has always been most seriously interested in saying about power and obligation and the relationship between exceptional capability and the responsibility that exceptional capability creates in the specific people who possess it and the specific institutions that express it. The Fallout series has never been simply a post-apocalyptic action game whose narrative engagement with its institutional actors is primarily the backdrop for the exploration and the combat that the gameplay requires. It has been, across its full accumulated canonical history, a sustained examination of the question of what power is for and what the specific institutional expressions of power in the post-war world reveal about the specific answers to that question that human beings arrive at when the specific conditions of the post-war world strip away the various social and political frameworks that the pre-war world had developed for managing the relationship between power and obligation. Sarah Lyons is the franchise's most direct and most personally realized expression of one specific answer to that question. The answer that says the specific obligation the power creates is real and must be met with the full weight of the capability the power provides, and the specific way her story ends is the franchise's most direct and most affecting expression of what happens to that specific answer and the specific person who embodied it in the specific world that the post-war wasteland is. The honest accounting of what the full examination of Sarah Lyons' life and death has produced the accounting that distinguishes between what the available canonical evidence directly establishes and what the examination's various interpretive moves have been used to support through steps whose validity the honest engagement must acknowledge, as contested rather than confirmed, is an accounting whose specific character requires the same combination of genuine conclusion and genuine uncertainty that the preceding sections have brought to the various specific questions the examination has engaged with. There are things the examination has established, there are things it has clarified, and there are things it must leave genuinely open because the available evidence genuinely leaves them open. And the honest accounting requires treating each category with the specific epistemic weight its specific character demands, rather than allowing the desire for a complete and satisfying account to collapse the distinctions between what is established and what is inferred, and what must simply be held in the honest uncertainty that the evidence requires. What the examination has established beyond reasonable interpretive dispute is a picture of Sarah Lyons that is both rich in its specific content and genuinely significant in its implications for understanding the capital wastelands, post-war history, and the Fallout franchise's engagement with the questions it has always been most seriously asking. She was the most capable field soldier the Lyons Brotherhood produced. The Sentinel rank's specific significance within the specific institutional context of the capital wasteland. Brotherhood established this as a genuine dabling assessment of genuine excellence, rather than simply the institutional accommodation of the Elder's family relationship. She was the commanding officer of Lyons Pride, the elite squad, whose specific composition and specific internal culture and specific operational record constitute the most fully developed single expression of what her leadership produced when it was given the specific institutional form that the Pride represented. She participated directly and consequentially in the events surrounding Project Purity's activation, the most consequential single sequence of events in the capital wasteland's post-war history, whose specific outcome determined whether the Enclave's plan to weaponize the Purifier's output would succeed, or whether the genuine humanitarian achievement of providing clean water to the entire capital wasteland population would be realized in the form that James and the Lone Wanderer had worked toward at such comprehensive cost. She survived those events and was alive at their conclusion. The canonical record's most directly established and most important single fact about her situation at the beginning of the decade that the gap in the canonical record encompasses, because it establishes the specific temporal starting point from which the examination of what the gap contained must proceed. She briefly held the elder position following her father's death. The canonical record establishes this with the same directness and the same limited specificity that it applies to every element of what Fallout 4 reveals about the decade, which is to say that it establishes the fact of the elder tenure without establishing the specific timing or the specific duration or the specific character of what the tenure involved in terms of the institutional dynamics it required. Navigating. She died. The canonical record establishes this with the same limited specificity, which is to say that it establishes the fact of the death without establishing the specific character of what killed her, or when within the decade it occurred, or what the specific circumstances of its occurrence were. And the Brotherhood underwent a comprehensive institutional transformation following her death. The canonical record establishes this most indirectly and most substantially through the specific character of the institution that appears in Fallout 4 as the expression of what the Brotherhood became in the years following the transition from Lyons leadership to Maxon leadership. What the examination has clarified, has made more precise and more honestly understood, without establishing, in the definitive sense that direct canonical documentation would require, is the specific character of what each of these established facts implies for the questions the examination has been organized around engaging with. The elder tenure's implications for understanding the specific character of the institutional dynamics that the decade between the two games contained, and what the specific combination of Sarah's institutional position and the institutional tensions that her continuation of her father's model would have created in the context of the post-Owen Brotherhood's specific situation most directly implies about the character of the period her tenure encompassed. The death's implications for understanding what the Brotherhood became Without her, the specific relationship between her absence and the specific institutional shift that her absence created the conditions for, and what the specific character of the transition from Lyons Brotherhood to Maxon Brotherhood most directly implies about what her presence had meant for the institution's ability to maintain the specific answer to the Brotherhood's fundamental question that the Lyons model expressed. The gap's implications for understanding what the franchise's sustained maintenance of the specific uncertainty about the character of her death is doing within its broader engagement with the Capital Wastelands story. The specific and deliberate character of the maintained ambiguity and what it is most honestly understood as expressing about the specific thing the franchise is choosing to do with the question of what happened to her. The strongest, honest form of the conclusion that the examination's engagement with the available theories about her death supports is the conclusion that combat death is the hypothesis most directly consistent with the most facts the canonical record establishes most consistent with the specific character of her continued operational engagement in the years following the Purifier's activation, most consistent with the specific character of the Capital Wastelands' ongoing threats and the ongoing operational demands they placed on the people addressing them, and most consistent with the general observation about base rates of survival for frontline soldiers in genuinely dangerous operational environments that the honest assessment of her specific situation most directly implies. But the honest form of this conclusion requires the specific and sustained acknowledgement that the gap between the best supported hypothesis and the established conclusion is a gap that the evidence genuinely leaves open, that the Sistache combat death hypothesis is the most directly supported hypothesis and not the established answer, and that the specific character of what separates those two epistemic positions is the specific character of what the canonical records maintained. Silence about the specific details of her death is most honestly understood as doing what the examination genuinely cannot establish, the honest and direct acknowledgement of the specific limits of what the available material permits. Concluding about the question the examination has been organized around is the specific answer to the question the title of this script poses. What happened to Sarah Lyons is not a question that the canonical record directly answers, and the honest engagement with the gap in the record that this specific non-answer represents requires treating the non-answer as itself a meaningful fact about the franchise's relationship to the question, rather than simply the residue of incomplete world-building awaiting eventual filling. The question is not simply unanswered, it is maintained in its unanswered state by the specific choices of the people responsible for the franchise's canonical development, and the specific form of the maintained unanswered state, its specific character as a question about a specific person whose specific significance within the franchise makes the specific silence about her specific fate a specific and deliberate thing rather than simply an accidental gap, is itself the most significant thing the examination has produced about the specific relationship between what happened to Sarah Lyons and what the franchise has decided to do with the question of what happened to her. What the honest engagement with the gap in the record reveals about the nature of the loss the gap represents about what Sarah's death meant for the wasteland and for the franchise's engagement with the questions the Didier Wasteland keeps asking is the dimension of the examination that the honest conclusion is most directly organized around expressing. Her death was the specific and irreversible removal from the capital wasteland of the specific person who most fully embodied the most affirmative available answer to the question of what genuine care for genuinely terrible conditions looks like when it is most complete and most honest in its expression. This is not the loss of a character in the narrative sense of the removal of a presence that had provided specific plot functions and whose absence created specific narrative gaps that needed to be filled by alternative presences. It is the loss, in the specific institutional and human terms that the full examination has traced, of the specific conditions that the specific person she was had created and sustained in the specific world, She inhabited conditions whose existence had depended substantially on the specific combination of individual character and personal history and direct engagement with the specific people and the specific situations that the capital wasteland contained that Sarah's specific life had expressed, and whose fragility in the face of her death was the fragility of conditions that had always been organized substantially around the specific person who had most fully maintained them. The silence that the franchise maintains about the specific character of her death is the most honest, available acknowledgement of what the loss was and what the appropriate relationship to it is. It says that there is no clean account of what killed her that would make the loss feel proportionate to the thing that was lost. Gap that the specific details of how she died could adequately fill, because the significance of what the gap contains is not the significance of the narrative information that the specific details of her death would provide, but the significance of the specific absence itself and what the specific character of that absence reveals about the specific fragility of the conditions that the most genuine and the most complete engagement with the wasteland's people requires. The silence says that the honest relationship to this specific loss is the relationship of holding it rather than resolving it, of understanding that the question of what happened to Sarah Lyons is a question that the most honest engagement with what she was and what the wasteland lost when it lost her requires sitting with in the specific discomfort of genuine uncertainty, rather than resolving into the specific comfort of a satisfying answer, whose specific form would be purchased at the cost of what the honest uncertainty most directly expresses about the nature of the loss. Rest now, fellow wanderer of the long dark, and let the question of what happened to Sarah Lyons settle into the specific form that genuinely important questions take when the examination that produced them has been honest enough and thorough enough to earn the rest that follows the honesty and the thoroughness, rather than the restless continuation of seeking that insufficient engagement always requires. We have traced the full arc together from the brotherhood that came east under her father's command and the specific institutional world that the coming east produced, through the specific childhood and the specific formation and the specific excellence that made her the soldier she became, through Lyons' pride and what it represented and what its commanding officer had built within it that was more than the simple sum of its members' considerable individual capabilities, through the Jefferson Memorial and the Purifier and the specific survival that the decade's beginning was organized around, through the gap in the record and what its specific character most honestly implies about the specific decade it encompasses, through the brotherhood that Maxon built in her absence and what the specific character of what that brotherhood became most directly reveals about what her presence had meant, through the theories about her death and what the honest assessment of each most directly supports, and where the honest assessment of each most directly requires the acknowledgement of genuine uncertainty, through the relationships that constituted the most direct available evidence about who she was as a person rather than as an institution, and through the legacy that what she stood for left behind in the specific world she had devoted her life to serving, and in the franchise's sustained engagement with the questions that the serving of that world keeps raising. The Potomac is still running. This is the most important single fact about what Sarah Lyons accomplished and what her accomplishment eventually cost her the specific and ongoing expression of the specific thing she helped make real in the specific moment that was both the most consequential of her life and the beginning of the decade whose specific contents the canonical record has chosen to leave in the specific form of the questions they raise rather than the answers they might have provided. The Purifier's output is flowing through the river whose cleaning was the project that her father's world had organized itself around, and that her engagement with the lone wanderer had made possible in the specific moment of the Jefferson Memorial's specific confrontation, and the specific fact of its continued flowing is the specific and ongoing testimony to what genuine care for genuinely terrible conditions produces when it is expressed by people who are willing to pay the specific costs that the expression requires. She paid those costs. The water is still running. The light is still on the Potomac in the dark, where the purifier is still doing what it was built to do, and what she helped it become able to do at the specific cost that the specific moment required. And the specific image of that light on that water in that dark is the most honest and the most enduring available expression of what Sarah Lyons was and what she left behind, and what the question of what happened to her is ultimately organized around holding rather than answering. Sleep now, wanderer. The capital wasteland is quieter than it was in the years when Sarah Lyons walked through it, quieter in the specific ways that the specific form of her absence has produced in the specific world that her presence had most directly shaped. The ruins of Washington, D.C. are still ruins, and the Brotherhood still occupies the citadel that her father built, and the river still runs clean through the city, whose monuments to the pre-war world's founding ideals stand in the specific irradiated silence that the 2 centuries since the bombs have filled them with. The question of what happened to her, of what specific thing in that specific decade ended the specific life that had meant what this account has tried to trace, is a question that the honest examination leaves in the specific form of genuine uncertainty, whose holding is itself the most honest available engagement with what the question is asking and what the wasteland most directly needs from the people who understand enough about her to ask it seriously. The purifier's light is on the water. The question keeps its patient watch in the dark. The Brotherhood of Steel is the franchise's most persistent and most philosophically demanding single institutional presence. The organization whose various incarnations across the full span of the Fallout series have consistently served as the most direct available expression of the questions about power and responsibility, and the relationship between exceptional capability and the obligation that exceptional capability creates toward the people living in the world the capability is operating within, that the franchise has always been most seriously interested in asking. Every installment that has engaged with the Brotherhood has engaged with some version of the same fundamental question: what is the Brotherhood for? What does its extraordinary combination of military power and technological sophistication and institutional organization imply about what it owes the Wasteland's people? And what the specific answer to those questions that any particular incarnation of the institution embodies reveals about the specific character of what the institution has become and what it has decided about itself and its relationship to the world it operates within. Sarah Lyons is not simply a character within this recurring institutional examination. She is the franchise's most fully developed and most directly affecting answer to the questions the examination keeps asking. The person whose specific combination of genuine Brotherhood capability and genuine care for the Wasteland's people represented the institution, looking most fully and most honestly at what its own values most clearly implied it should be doing, and actually doing it, rather than finding the various institutional justifications for not doing it that the Brotherhood's traditional doctrine had always provided. The Brotherhood's fundamental question has been answered differently by every major institutional expression the franchise has documented across its accumulated canonical history, and the range of those answers is itself informative about what the franchise understands the question to be genuinely asking, rather than simply the backdrop for the various narrative conflicts that the Brotherhood's presence in different wasteland environments has enabled. The West Coast Brotherhood of the original games was an institution that had retreated into a specific and self-protective insularity that had concluded the Wasteland's people and the Wasteland's problems were not its concern, and that its specific responsibilities were to the technology it had preserved and to the institutional survival of the organization, whose purpose was the preservation of that technology. This was a coherent answer to the Brotherhood's fundamental question, and the specific form of its coherence, the specific way it resolved the tension between the institution's extraordinary capability and the obvious needs of the people living in proximity to that capability by simply denying that the tension created any obligation was the coherence of a specific institutional choice rather than the necessary implication of what the Brotherhood was. The Mojave Brotherhood of Fallout New Vegas was an institution that had been broken by the specific failure of its most ambitious attempt to address the fundamental question in a form that went beyond simple insularity, that had tried to be something more than the West Coast model, and had paid the specific and comprehensive price of that attempt, in the form of the destruction that the NCR's superior military force had visited upon it at Helios 1 and in the NCR's subsequent years of retreat and attrition that the defeat at Helios initiated. The Commonwealth Brotherhood of Fallout 4 was an institution that had returned to something closer to the traditional model under Maxon's leadership, while being more powerful than any previous Brotherhood expression, and therefore more capable of pursuing the traditional model's specific form of institutional priority, with the comprehensive effectiveness that genuine power provides, when it is combined with the institutional clarity of purpose that comes from having resolved the fundamental question in a specific and unambiguous direction. Against this range of answers, the Lyons Brotherhood's specific answer stands as the most directly and the most uncomplicatedly affirmative available response to the Brotherhood's fundamental question, the most complete expression of what the institution looks like when it takes seriously the obvious implication that extraordinary capability creates genuine obligation toward the people living in proximity to it and toward the world that the capability is operating within. The Lyons Brotherhood did not resolve the tension between capability and obligation by denying the obligation or by treating the wastelands people as problems to be managed rather than human beings whose welfare the institution was positioned to meaningfully improve. It resolved the tension by accepting the obligation and organizing the institution around fulfilling it by treating the protection of the capital wasteland's civilian population as the central expression of the Brotherhood's mission in the specific context of what the capital wasteland required, rather than as the distraction from the real mission of technology acquisition that the traditional doctrine would have characterized it as being. This is the specific character of the answer that Sarah Lyons embodied most fully and expressed most directly in the conduct of her life, and the specific significance of that embodiment for the franchise's ongoing engagement with the Brotherhood's fundamental question is the significance of a genuinely affirmative answer to a question the franchise has more often explored through the various forms of the negative, through the various ways the Brotherhood has failed to be what its values most clearly implied it should be, through the various institutional rationalizations the Brotherhood has developed for the various specific forms of the obligation it has declined to meet. The Lyons model's specific advantages over the traditional Brotherhood approach are worth examining with the concreteness that the honest assessment requires, rather than simply characterizing the difference in the abstract language of more humane institutional orientation that the comparison's most superficial form tends to produce. What the Lyons Brotherhood did that the traditional Brotherhood did not do was make the lives of specific people in specific communities specifically better in specific and measurable ways. It reduced the supermutant threat in the capital wasteland to a level that the civilian population could survive in ways they could not have survived if the Brotherhood's presence in the region had been organized around the traditional model's specific priorities rather than the Lyons model's specific commitments. The people of Rivet City had a relationship with the Brotherhood that provided specific benefits, whose specific character was the specific character of what an institution with genuine military capability and genuine institutional investment in the community's welfare was able to provide for a community that had genuine need of both. The various smaller communities scattered across the DC ruins had a relationship with the Brotherhood that was organized around the genuine and direct engagement with their specific situations that the Lyons model required, rather than the managed distance that the traditional model had always maintained between the institution and the wasteland's civilian population as the necessary expression of the institutional priorities that the traditional doctrine reflected. The Lyons model's specific vulnerabilities are also worth acknowledging honestly, rather than treating the model as the simply superior alternative. whose only limitation was the specific historical accident of not surviving in this institutional form that would have allowed it to continue expressing what it stood for across the subsequent decades. The specific cost of the commitment to civilian protection that the Lyons model required was a cost that the institution bore in real and significant terms. Institution that was less powerful in the conventional institutional sense than it might otherwise have been if its resources had been directed primarily toward institutional expansion and technological acquisition rather than toward ongoing operational demands of protecting a large civilian population against the specific and continuous threats that the capital wasteland concentrated in its specific geography and its specific history. The West Coast Brotherhood's specific form of institutional insularity was, among other things, a specific form of resource conservation that made the institution more resilient in the specific sense of being less dependent on the ongoing success of its operational commitments for its continued institutional viability. The Lyons Brotherhood's specific form of institutional engagement with the wasteland's people created dependencies and vulnerabilities that the traditional model's insularity had avoided, and the specific character of what those dependencies and vulnerabilities meant for the institution's long-term survival, in the specific form that made it most worth surviving, is itself part of the honest account of what the Lyons model was and what its expression in the specific institutional context of the capital wasteland ultimately produced for the institution and for the people the institution was serving. Sarah's embodiment of the Lyons model was not simply the institutional expression of her father's vision, maintained and continued in the person of his most capable successor. It was the specific and personal expression of a specific set of values that she had arrived at through the specific and direct experience of living within the world. Those values were organized around serving values whose specific character in her specific expression was the character of genuine and personal investment rather than institutional obligation performed by someone who had been trained to perform it. The difference between those two forms of the same values, between the institutional performance of care and the genuine personal investment in the welfare of the specific people. The care is organized around serving is the difference that the most direct and the most honest engagement with who Sarah Lyons was consistently produces in the person doing the engagement. And the specific character of that difference is itself one of the more important things the franchise has contributed to the examination of the Brotherhood's fundamental question through the specific vehicle of her specific story. The institutional expression of the Lyons model was always available to be continued. In some form, the values could be articulated, the policies could be maintained, the operational commitments could be continued by whatever institutional successor the Brotherhood's hierarchy produced. What could not be continued in the same form, because what could not be transferred to an institutional successor in the same way that policies and operational commitments can be transferred, was the specific and personal quality of Sarah's investment in the specific people and the specific world the model was organized around serving. That investment was hers specifically, and it expressed itself in ways whose specific character reflected who she specifically was, and its loss in the specific form of her death was therefore a loss whose full character exceeded what any account of the institutional shift that followed it could adequately contain. The franchise's engagement with the Brotherhood question through the specific trajectory of Sarah's story, the specific arc from the most affirmative available expression of the Lyons model's answer to the Brotherhood's fundamental question through the death that removed that expression from the institutional landscape of the wasteland, and the comprehensive institutional shift that the removal enabled is the most direct and the most affecting contribution the Fallout series has made to its sustained examination of what power is for, and what the relationship between extraordinary capability and genuine obligation toward the people living in the world the capability operates within actually requires of the specific institutions that possess both the capability and the capacity to acknowledge or deny the obligation. Sarah Lyons represents the franchise's clearest single answer to the question of what the Brotherhood would look like if it genuinely took its own best values seriously and expressed them in the most complete available form, rather than finding the various institutional rationalizations for the various specific forms of the obligation those values created that the Brotherhood's various other expressions have consistently produced. And the specific way her story ends, the specific fact that the most complete available expression of the Brotherhood's best values was removed from the institutional landscape of the capital wasteland by a death whose specific circumstances the canonical record has chosen not to document, and whose institutional consequences the Brotherhood's subsequent development expressed in the form of the comprehensive shift away from everything her expression had represented, is the franchise's most affecting single contribution to the examination of the specific fragility of the wasteland's best possibilities and the specific ease with which the conditions that make those possibilities real can be dissolved by the specific losses that the wasteland's particular form of brutal contingency consistently produces. The honest accounting for what the full examination of Sarah Lyons' life and death has produced, the accounting that distinguishes with genuine care between what the available canonical evidence directly establishes, what the examination's various interpretive moves have clarified without establishing, and what must be left genuinely open because the available evidence genuinely leaves it open, is an accounting whose specific character requires the same combination of genuine conclusion and genuine uncertainty that the preceding 10 sections have brought to the various specific questions the examination has engaged with across the full span of the account. There are things the examination has established, there are things it has clarified, and there are things it must leave, in the honest form of genuine uncertainty whose maintenance is itself the most important intellectual achievement the examination can produce relative to the specific question it has been organized around, because the false certainty of a satisfying conclusion whose specific form is purchased at the cost of the evidence's actual character is a conclusion that serves the desire for resolution rather than the honest engagement with the question that the question's actual importance demands. What the examination has established beyond reasonable interpretive dispute is a picture of Sarah Lyons that is both rich in its specific content and genuinely significant in its implications for understanding the capital wastelands, post-war history, and the franchise's engagement with the questions it has always been most seriously asking. She was the most capable field soldier the Lyons Brotherhood produced, holding the sentinel rank in its specific institutional context as a genuine assessment of genuine excellence rather than the institutional accommodation of family proximity to power. She was the commanding officer of Lyons Pride, whose specific composition and specific internal culture and specific operational record constitute the most fully developed single expression of what her leadership produced when it was given the specific institutional form that the Pride represented. She was present and alive at the conclusion of the events surrounding Project Purity's activation, and she survived the sequence of events that the Jefferson Memorial confrontation required navigating. She briefly held the elder position following her father's death. She died during the decade between Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, and the Brotherhood underwent a comprehensive institutional transformation following her death that expressed itself in the specific character of the institution that appears in Fallout 4 as what the Brotherhood became in the years of Maxon's leadership following the transition from everything the Lyons Brotherhood had represented. What the examination has clarified has made more precise and more honestly understood without establishing in the definitive sense that direct canonical documentation would require is the specific character of what each of these established facts implies for the questions the examination has been organized around engaging with. The elder tenure's implications for the institutional dynamics of the post-Owen Brotherhood, the death's implications for what the Brotherhood became without the specific person who had most fully expressed what the Lyons model was, the transition's implications for the specific people whose lives had been organized around the Lyons Brotherhood's specific commitments and who found themselves in the aftermath of the transition in a relationship with a genuinely different institution occupying the same formal institutional position. The gap's implications for understanding what the franchise's sustained maintenance of the specific uncertainty about the character of her death is doing within its broader engagement with the capital wasteland story, and with the specific thing the story of Sarah Lyons is most honestly understood as expressing within that broader engagement. The strongest honest form of the conclusion the examination supports is the conclusion that holds the genuine force of the available evidence without overstating what that force establishes in terms of the specific answer to the specific question the examination has been organized around. Combat death remains the hypothesis most directly consistent with the most facts the canonical record establishes, most consistent with who she was and what she continued to do and what the environment she continued to do it in was, consistently producing for the people working within it. The institutional conflict hypothesis retains a genuine and disturbing plausibility that the honest assessment cannot simply dismiss in favor of the cleaner and more comfortable account of simple operational loss. The disease and injury hypotheses remain genuinely possible in the specific ways that the evidence's failure to exclude them requires acknowledging, and none of these hypotheses is established in the specific sense that the evidence's actual character would require for the confident adoption of any of them as the settled conclusion. This is the honest position. It is less comfortable than a verdict. It is more accurate than a verdict would be. And the specific form of its accuracy, its specific faithfulness to the specific character of the evidence whose examination the account has conducted, is the form of accuracy that the honest engagement with a genuinely important question most directly requires. What Sarah Lyons meant, what the specific quality of her life, and the specific character of her legacy, and the specific form of her absence from the wasteland she spent her life serving most directly expresses about what the wasteland is and what it requires of the people who genuinely care about it, is the dimension of the examination that the honest conclusion is most directly organized around expressing with the full weight it deserves. She meant that the Brotherhood's most affirmative answer to its most fundamental question was real and possible in the specific world of the capital wasteland, that the combination of genuine military capability and genuine care for the people living within the reach of that capability was not simply the idealized alternative to the various forms of the obligations denial that the Brotherhood's various other expressions had produced, but the actual and living expression of what the institution looked like when it took its own values most seriously and acted on them most completely. She meant that Lyons' pride was possible, that the specific community of specific people who shared service and shared danger and shared commitment had been built into something whose specific character exceeded what any collection of individually excellent soldiers could simply be assembled into was possible, and that what made it possible was the specific quality of the specific person whose leadership had produced it. She meant that Project Purity was possible, that the specific and ambitious and enormously consequential project of providing clean water to the entire capital wasteland population was achievable in the specific institutional and human context of the Lyons Brotherhood's engagement with the capital wasteland's most significant humanitarian challenge. And she meant that all of these possibilities were more fragile than the specific confidence with which the Lyons Brotherhood had pursued them, had perhaps fully acknowledged that the specific conditions that made them real were conditions organized substantially around specific people whose presence was contingent in the specific and brutal way that all human presence in all wastelands is contingent, and whose absence would therefore dissolve the specific conditions of the possibility's reality in the specific and irreversible way that the loss of the specific people who most fully expressed those possibilities always dissolved. The conditions that their expression had created. Rest now, fellow wanderer of the long dark, and let the full weight of what this account has traced settle into the specific form that genuinely held things take, when the holding has been done with sufficient care and sufficient honesty to produce something more valuable than the the simple comfort of a satisfying conclusion, the specific and harder one comfort of understanding what the question is actually asking, and why the honest engagement with its genuine complexity is more faithful to what Sarah Lyons was and what her story means than any resolution into the false certainty of a specific answer whose purchase price is the suppression of everything the evidence genuinely leaves open. We have walked through all of it together, the brotherhood that came east and the institutional world it produced, the soldier who grew up within that world and became what the world and the institution and the father and the specific experience of the specific people she had spent her life among had combined to make her Lyons' pride and what it represented in the most human and the most institutional dimensions simultaneously available. The Jefferson Memorial and the purifier and the light on the Potomac and the specific survival that the decade's beginning was organized around. The gap in the record and the decade it encompasses, and the theories about what the gap contains, and the honest uncertainty that the theory's honest assessment most directly produces. The brotherhood that became something different in her absence, and what the difference most directly reveals about what her presence had been. The relationships that were the most human and the most direct expression of who she was. The legacy that what she stood for left behind in the specific world she had served, and in the franchise's sustained engagement with the questions that serving that world keeps raising. And finally, the honest and difficult conclusion that the examination's full span has produced, which is not the satisfying resolution the question's form implies as a possibility, but the more valuable and more honest understanding of what the question is and why its specific form of unresolved complexity is more faithful to what Sarah Lyons was and what her absence means than any specific answer could be. The Potomac is still running. The purifier is still turning the river's water into something the wastelands people can drink without the specific and comprehensive damage that the radiation-saturated water of the unclean river produces in the bodies of the people who drink it over time. This is what she helped make real. This is what the specific moment at the Jefferson Memorial, whatever the specific form of that moment's ending was in the canonical sequence, the franchise assumes produced for the specific people of the capital wasteland, who have been drinking clean water in the years since its production. The light on the water is her legacy in the most concrete and the most enduring available form, and the specific fact of its continued presence in the wasteland she spent her life serving is itself the most honest and the most permanent available answer to the question of what she was and what she left behind, more honest than any account of the specific character of her death could be, more permanent than any institutional record of her achievements and her tenure and her passing could express, because it is the specific and ongoing expression of the specific thing she most directly cared about and most completely gave herself to, and that her giving produced in the specific world where the giving happened. Rest now, fellow wanderer of the long dark, and let the question of what happened to Sarah Lyons settle gently into the specific form that genuinely important questions take when the examination that produced them has been conducted with sufficient honesty to earn the rest that follows it. We have traced the full arc together from the brotherhood that came east, through the soldier who grew up within it, through Lyons' pride and the Jefferson Memorial, and the decade of silence and the brotherhood that her absence shaped, through everything the canonical record provides and everything it has chosen to leave in the specific form of the questions it raises rather than the answers it might have given. The Potomac is still running. The purifier's light is still on the water in the dark where the river carries everything the wasteland holds downstream into the long quiet that eventually finds everything the world has touched and held and lost. She helped make that light real. It is still burning. Sleep now, wanderer. Let the river carry the question gently into the dark where it belongs, not resolved, but held. The way the water holds the light, the way the wasteland holds its most important silences, the way the honest dark holds everything that genuinely mattered and still does.